It was late September of 2016, the kind of time when summer feels like it's giving up, but the cold hasn't fully taken over yet. I had been planning a solo camping trip for a while. Nothing extreme, just a few days out in the woods near a small lake in northern Oregon. I'd been working nonstop that year, and I wanted quiet. No people, no phone signal, no lights except my campfire. I left home early in the morning, packed everything in the back of my old gray Tacoma. Tent, cooler, sleeping bag, stove, a couple of flashlights, a hatchet, a folding chair, and enough food for 3 nights. The drive took almost 4 hours. By the time I reached the gravel road leading into the forest, the sky had turned gray and heavy, like it might rain later. The campsite wasn't official, just a small clearing I'd marked on a map months earlier. It sat about a mile from a narrow lake that was half hidden behind trees and tall grass. There wasn't another car or person around for miles. The air smelled like pine and wet soil. I parked the truck near the edge of the clearing, unloaded my gear, and pitched the tent near a line of trees to break some of the wind. By evening, I had a fire going. The sound of the woods was something I'd missed. Crickets, the occasional crack of a branch, distant water lapping against the lake shore. It made me feel small in a good way. I cooked some beans and sausage on my small stove, ate slowly, and watched the fire burn down to glowing coals. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt. The first night was uneventful. I woke up once or twice when the wind picked up, but otherwise it was fine. The next day, I went fishing at the lake, caught nothing, then hiked around for a bit. It started to drizzle around noon. The smell of wet pine needles filled the air, and everything looked darker, quieter. By late afternoon, I was back at camp, sitting in my chair with a can of beer, staring into the woods. That was when I noticed it. Something small hanging from a tree branch about 20 feet away. At first, I thought it was just a piece of old rope or a bit of trash someone had left behind. But when I walked closer, I saw it was a small bundle of fabric, tied tightly with string. It looked like a bandana wrapped around something solid. I didn't want to touch it, so I just stood there, staring. Maybe someone used it as a marker. Maybe it was trash. I didn't overthink it. That night, though, I started to feel uneasy. The drizzle turned into steady rain around 9 p.m., and the forest grew loud with the sound of water dripping from branches. I was sitting inside my tent, reading, when I heard something faint outside. It wasn't footsteps exactly, more like the sound of someone dragging something through wet leaves. It would stop for a bit, then start again. I froze. I listened hard, trying to make sense of it. It didn't sound like an animal. It moved too slowly, too rhythmically. I turned off my lantern and waited in silence. The rain softened, and for a second, I thought I could hear breathing. I stayed still for a long time, gripping the handle of the hatchet I kept beside my sleeping bag. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise made me sit up and listen. When morning came, everything looked normal again. The ground around my tent was covered in wet leaves, but no footprints. I checked the area near the tree where I'd seen the fabric bundle. It was gone. That made my stomach sink a bit. I told myself it could have been anything. Maybe the rain loosened it and it fell. Maybe some animal dragged it away. I tried to brush it off, packed a small bag, and decided to hike up a ridge to get a view of the valley. The woods were thick, dark, and quiet. I walked for about an hour before I came across something else that stopped me cold. An old campsite. It looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. A rusted folding chair sat near the remains of a fire pit, and a torn tarp hung half-collapsed from 2 trees. There were some empty cans, half buried under dirt, and what looked like a cooler tipped over and cracked. Everything about it felt off. I didn't see any signs of who had been there or when, but the place had this strange heaviness to it, like whoever left never came back for their stuff. I didn't stay long. On the way back, I felt watched. It's hard to explain. It wasn't a sound or movement, just that crawling feeling between your shoulder blades, like something's eyes are on you. By the time I got back to my camp, I was sweating even though the air was cold. That night, the rain stopped, but the wind picked up hard. The trees creaked, and branches snapped somewhere in the dark. Around midnight, I heard it again, the dragging sound. Closer this time. It circled my tent slowly, like someone walking around me. I held my breath and stayed still. The sound stopped directly behind my tent, and I could hear faint crunches of wet ground shifting under weight. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and hatchet, unzipped the tent fast, and swung the light in every direction. Nothing, just trees swaying, rain dripping from leaves, and my breath coming out heavy. I felt ridiculous standing there, soaking wet, flashlight shaking in my hand. I checked around the camp, the truck, even the tree line. No tracks, no movement. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten. When morning came, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Near the fire pit, there were deep marks in the mud, like someone had dragged a stick or maybe a long object back and forth. But the part that really bothered me was the prints near it. Not boot prints, not animal tracks. Bare feet, small, muddy, and deep enough to show someone had been standing there for a while. I don't know why I didn't leave right then. Maybe pride, maybe denial. I told myself it could have been someone camping nearby, someone lost, or some hiker messing around. I decided I'd stay one more night and then pack up early. That day, I didn't go anywhere. I stayed near the fire, listening, watching. I thought about that old campsite and the missing bundle from the tree. Everything felt too connected. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds were gone. When night fell, I didn't light a fire. I stayed inside the tent with my flashlight off, sitting in silence, listening. Around 2 a.m., the dragging sound came again, softer this time, slower. It circled the tent once, then stopped. I could hear faint breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Then came a light scraping sound, like fingers brushing against the fabric of the tent. I waited until the breathing stopped, then slowly reached for the zipper. I yanked it open and shone my flashlight out. For a split second, I saw someone or something at the edge of the light, a figure barefoot standing half behind a tree. Too far to make out the face, but close enough to see wet clothes sticking to their body. When the light hit them, they moved fast, disappeared into the dark without a sound. That was it. I didn't wait for dawn. I threw everything into the truck, didn't even bother folding the tent, and drove down the muddy road as fast as I could without wrecking. My hands were shaking the entire way. By the time I hit the main road, the sun was coming up. I pulled over once I saw a gas station, sat there for a long time and tried to calm down. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone walked around my tent at night? No one would believe it mattered. A week later, I couldn't shake it, so I looked up the area online. That's when I found a forum post from years earlier about a missing camper not far from where I'd been. They found his truck near a lake but never found him. The description of his campsite sounded too familiar. I've been camping plenty of times since then, but never alone. And I've never gone back to Oregon. Sometimes, when it rains at night, I still wake up thinking I can hear that slow dragging sound just outside. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to spend a few days alone camping in the south of France. I had been traveling around Europe for a few weeks, and after so much time in crowded hostels and cities, I wanted quiet. Just me, the woods, and the sound of wind through the trees. I found a small, almost hidden campsite near the edge of a forest outside a town called St. Verin. One of those places you only find by mistake. It wasn't an official campground, more like a clearing near a stream that looked untouched for years. The nearest sign of people was a tiny farmhouse about a mile down the dirt road. I parked my rental car under a few tall pines, carried my backpack and tent out, and set everything up near the edge of the clearing. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth. The ground was soft, covered in brown needles, and the sound of the running water nearby was steady, almost calming. I had brought enough food and water for 3 days, along with a small camping stove, flashlight, and a first aid kit. I felt prepared, even a little proud of myself for doing something so isolated. The first day was peaceful. I spent most of it walking through the nearby trails, taking pictures of wildflowers and insects, and sitting by the stream watching the light move through the trees. Around evening, I cooked some pasta and sat outside my tent while the sun went down behind the hills. The sky turned a deep orange, then slowly faded into gray. The temperature dropped quickly once the light was gone, so I zipped up my jacket and sat by the small campfire I made. The crackle of burning twigs mixed with the distant chirping of insects. It was quiet except for one thing. Every once in a while, I thought I heard something faint beyond the trees. A quick rustle or the sound of dry branches snapping. At first, I assumed it was animals. Maybe a deer, maybe a fox. The forest was full of small noises, and I tried not to let my mind wander. When I went to bed that night, I left my flashlight within reach, just in case. The second day started normally. I woke up early, washed my face in the stream, and made some coffee on the stove. The morning air was cold enough to see my breath. Around noon, I decided to hike up one of the nearby hills. There was an old dirt path that went higher into the forest, probably used by hunters or woodcutters years ago. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. I didn't see any signs of people, no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was on that hike that I noticed something strange. About halfway up, there was a small clearing with a tree stump in the center. On the stump, there were pieces of old rope, frayed and dirty, as if someone had cut them recently. Beside it, I saw an empty can of food and a torn plastic bag. It didn't look like something left behind by campers. It looked more like someone had been living there or using it as a stop. There were cigarette butts on the ground, and one of them still looked fresh. A chill went through me. I didn't like the feeling of being watched, but as I looked around, I didn't see anyone. The woods were still. No wind, no birds. I didn't stay long. I turned around and went back down to my camp. By late afternoon, I tried to shake it off. I told myself there were probably hikers or workers around, and I was just overthinking things. Still, when night came, I couldn't relax. I sat by the fire again, but I kept glancing into the trees, listening. The same faint snapping sounds came again, a little closer this time. I turned off my fire early and went into my tent, hoping sleep would make it all go away. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire outside had gone completely cold. The only sound was the faint rush of the stream. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on dry needles. My tent was zipped closed, but I could see the faint outline of a shadow moving past, tall and thin, stopping every few seconds. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. The sound moved around my tent once, slow and careful, then stopped again. For a long time, nothing happened. I lay there frozen, barely breathing, trying not to make a sound. Then I heard something like metal scraping against something hard. It was quiet but sharp, a sound that made every muscle in my body tense. Came from the direction of my car. Eventually, after what felt like hours, everything went silent again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just waited until the first light started creeping through the trees. When morning came, I unzipped my tent slowly and stepped outside. The forest looked normal again. Birds were chirping. The stream sparkled in the sunlight. But then I looked at my car. There were muddy footprints leading from the trees to the back of it. The trunk handle was scratched, like someone had tried to pry it open with something metal. I checked the doors. One of them was slightly ajar. Inside, my backpack had been moved, and one of my water bottles was missing. That's when I noticed something even stranger. A small piece of rope, like the ones I saw near the stump, was lying on the ground near my car's back tire. It looked like it had been freshly cut. I packed everything up fast. My hands were shaking as I shoved my gear into the trunk. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. When I turned the key, the car started, but as I pulled out of the clearing, I saw movement in my rearview mirror. A figure standing between the trees, half hidden by the shadows. He wasn't close, maybe 50 feet away, but I could tell he was staring straight at me. He was wearing a dark jacket, the kind that looked heavy and worn, and a faded cap pulled low over his face. He didn't move, not even when the car rolled backward a little on the dirt road. I could only see the bottom half of his face, but there was something about the stillness of his body that felt wrong. He wasn't hiking, he wasn't wandering, he was just there, watching. I drove away as fast as I could, the tires kicking up dirt behind me. The road was bumpy and narrow, and my hands kept slipping on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the main paved road miles away. Even then, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see that same figure walking out of the trees. When I finally reached the next town, I stopped at a small gas station and parked. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down. My chest hurt from how hard my heart had been racing. I got out to stretch, and that's when I noticed another detail that made my stomach drop. On the back of my car, near the license plate, there was a smear of dirt shaped like a handprint. It wasn't mine. I hadn't touched that part of the car since I arrived. I told myself to let it go. Maybe it was just some local wanderer, someone living rough in the woods, looking for supplies. Maybe he didn't mean harm. But the more I thought about the footsteps, the rope, the scratches, the staring figure, it didn't feel like coincidence. That night, in a small roadside hotel, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside the window made me jump. I kept replaying the moment I saw him standing there, still and silent. He had known I was there. He had been waiting. I left France 2 days later. I didn't go back to the campsite to get anything I might have left behind. Even now, when I look at the pictures I took during that trip, the ones of the forest and the stream, I feel uneasy. They look calm, peaceful, but I know what was there, somewhere behind those trees. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night, if I hadn't left the next morning. Maybe he would have tried the tent next. Maybe he already had and was waiting for me to wake up. I'll never really know, but every time I camp alone now, even in safe places, I find myself listening more carefully to the sounds outside. I never ignore the small noises anymore, because I learned that night in the woods of St. Verin. Sometimes the things you hear in the dark aren't animals, they're people, and some of them don't want to be found. I was 28 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through northern Montana. It was late September of 2016, right before the weather started to turn cold. I'd been working construction jobs all summer, and my mind was burned out from the noise, the heat, and the constant smell of asphalt and diesel. I wanted quiet, just me, a tent, and the sound of the woods. I drove up from Missoula early one morning, my old green Tacoma loaded with gear. The back seat was a mess of blankets, a cooler, and a duffel bag stuffed with clothes. I had a cheap Walmart tent, a small stove, some canned chili, a hatchet, and a beat-up hunting knife I'd owned since high school. The plan was simple: find a remote spot near the Flathead River, camp for 3 nights, and then head back before the first snow. The drive north was peaceful. The road stretched endlessly through pine forests, the asphalt shining wet from the night's rain. I passed maybe 2 other cars in an hour. When I finally turned off onto a dirt road that cut deep into the forest, I lost cell service. That was expected. I actually felt good about it. No calls, no texts, just quiet. The dirt road was rough, filled with ruts and puddles. I followed it for about 7 miles until it narrowed into what looked like an old logging trail. I parked beside a wide bend in the river, where the trees opened just enough to see the water glinting silver under the afternoon light. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and wet earth. I could hear nothing but the rush of the river and the wind in the branches. I set up camp just before dusk, pitched the tent near a flat patch of grass, gathered some wood and got a small fire going. The sound of the flames crackling mixed with the water made me feel calm. I ate a can of chili straight from the pot and watched the sky fade from orange to black. That first night was uneventful, but I didn't sleep much. It wasn't fear, just the kind of alertness that comes from being alone in the woods. Every small rustle pulled my attention. Branches cracked in the distance, and once I heard something splash in the river. Probably a deer. Still, I slept in short bursts, waking often to listen. By morning, fog had rolled across the river like smoke. My tent was damp. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, and decided to hike up the ridge that ran behind the riverbank. I wanted to see how far the woods went. I carried only a small backpack, a bottle of water, my knife, and a granola bar. The hike wasn't hard, but it was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds seemed muted. The forest was thick, with fallen logs and ferns covering the ground. I kept track of my path, marking tree bark with my knife every few 100 feet. After about an hour, I reached a clearing where the ground dipped into a small valley. I saw something down there, a structure maybe 50 yards away. It looked like an old shack. The roof sagged inward, and one side was half collapsed. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked down carefully, stepping over rotting branches. The closer I got, the worse it smelled. A sour, decaying stench that clung to the air. When I reached the shack, I saw animal bones scattered around the front. Deer bones, mostly ribs, legs, skulls bleached white. Some looked fresh, still dark with sinew. There were empty beer cans nearby, rusted old ones, and a couple of plastic jugs that had turned yellow from the sun. The place didn't look lived in, but someone had been there not long ago. I didn't go inside. The smell was too strong, and the roof looked like it could fall at any second. I backed away, uneasy now. It felt wrong, like stumbling into someone's space, even if that someone wasn't there. I hiked back fast. The forest felt different on the return trip, heavier, like the air itself was thicker. When I finally got back to my tent, the light was fading. I noticed something odd immediately. My tent flap was open. I was sure I had zipped it closed that morning. I told myself maybe the wind had done it, or I hadn't pulled the zipper all the way down. Inside, nothing looked missing, but a few things were moved. My flashlight, which I'd left beside my sleeping bag, was now on top of my cooler. My hatchet was lying outside near the fire pit. That night, I didn't light a fire. I just sat in the dark, inside the tent, listening. The woods seemed restless, branches creaking, faint rustles close by. At one point, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps circling near the edge of the river. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still. The steps stopped, then nothing. I barely slept at all. Every few minutes, I flicked my flashlight on, scanning the tent walls, the shadows shifting outside. I kept my knife in my hand, my heart thudding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When the sun finally rose, I decided I'd had enough. I started packing immediately, stuffing everything into the truck as fast as I could. I wanted to get back to the highway before anything else happened. But when I went to load my cooler, I saw footprints. Clear, heavy prints in the mud near where my fire pit had been. They were from boots, not animals. Adult-sized, deep enough to show the tread clearly. Someone had been there, watching. I drove out fast, bouncing down the dirt trail, glancing in the mirror every few seconds. The forest seemed endless, and I didn't relax until I saw pavement again. I stopped at a gas station about 40 miles south, just to breathe. While filling up, I noticed something wedged under the latch of my truck's tailgate. A small, folded piece of paper, soaked from the rain. I opened it. There was nothing written on it, just a smear of what looked like mud or maybe dried blood. I tossed it, got in the truck, and didn't stop again until I was back in town. That night, after a long shower, I checked my gear in the garage. Everything seemed normal, but something bothered me. My hatchet, the one I'd found outside my tent, had dried dirt on the blade, darker than the soil where I'd camped. It looked more like old rust or something else. Couldn't tell. I cleaned it and put it away, but that image stuck with me. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking about that shack. I'd seen no other vehicles, no fresh tracks leading that way. Yet someone had clearly been living out there or hiding out there. I looked online, trying to find any record of old cabins or missing hunters in that area. There were mentions of squatters and some reports of poachers caught in the national forest, but nothing that matched what I'd found. I never went back. I still like the woods, but now I stick to public campgrounds, the kind with other people close by and lights that stay on through the night. Every once in a while, though, when I'm driving north and I see a river cutting through the trees, I remember that place. The fog rolling across the water, the smell of decay near that shack, the open tent flap, and those quiet footsteps circling me in the dark. It wasn't fear of the woods that stayed with me. It was knowing that out there, in all that emptiness, someone was watching. Close enough to touch my things, close enough to leave a print in the mud, and silent enough to make me question if I'd imagined it. But I know I didn't, because that piece of paper under my tailgate wasn't there when I set up camp. Someone had to put it there, and they had to do it while I was sleeping. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to go on a solo hunting and camping trip deep in the northern woods of Montana. I was 32 back then, working long weeks at a warehouse, barely seeing daylight. Hunting had always been my way to disconnect, to get away from noise, people, and the endless hum of city life. I'd been to these woods before, but this time I wanted to go deeper, farther than I had ever gone. I wanted to hunt elk, maybe even stay out there for 4 or 5 nights if the weather held. The drive took almost 7 hours from Billings. I left early in the morning before the sun was up with my truck loaded, tent, rifle, sleeping bag, propane stove, and enough food to last me a week. The air was sharp with cold even during the day, and most of the trees had already shed their leaves. The roads turned from asphalt to gravel, then to dirt. I parked the truck off a narrow logging trail that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a sign half-rotten on a post that read, "No maintenance beyond this point." That was exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, just silence in the woods. I hiked for hours that afternoon, following old game trails and crossing a few creeks until I found a clearing tucked between thick pines and birches. The ground was soft with needles, and there was a flat patch perfect for the tent. I set up camp as the sun started to drop, my breath turning white in the air. The quietness of the place was heavy. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in the city. It was alive but empty, filled with faint creaks from trees and distant rustling. Every sound carried farther out here. That night, I made a small fire, cooked some beans, and sat listening to the forest. The sky was clear, stars sharp like cold glass. Somewhere far off, I heard an elk's bugle echo through the valley. A long, deep call that faded slowly. It made the hair on my arms rise. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be there, alone, away from everything. I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep to the faint pop of the dying fire. The first morning was quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the trees. I made coffee and hiked out before sunrise with my rifle, heading north into a stretch of thick timber where the elk trails were fresh. Around noon, I spotted a small herd grazing down near a stream, too far for a clean shot. I waited, crouched behind a fallen log, for almost an hour before they drifted out of sight. I decided to circle around to catch their trail again, but by the time I reached the other side, they were gone. When I got back to camp, I noticed something odd. The ground near my tent looked disturbed, like something heavy had stepped close to it. At first, I thought it might have been a deer or maybe even a bear sniffing around. I checked my food. Everything was still sealed and hung from a tree, just how I'd left it. The fire pit looked untouched. Still, there was something off. The prints were deep, spaced far apart, and not quite right for a bear. The toes looked longer. I shook it off, told myself it was probably just my eyes playing tricks, and spent the rest of the afternoon collecting firewood. That night, I couldn't fall asleep easily. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed and groaned. I kept hearing small cracks and snaps, like branches breaking somewhere far off. Every few minutes, I'd lift my head from the sleeping bag and listen, holding my breath. The sounds came and went, sometimes close, sometimes distant. At some point, I finally drifted off, though the sleep was light and broken. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to something moving outside my tent. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I could hear dry leaves crunching softly. It wasn't the kind of random movement animals make. It was steady, like something walking on two legs. I froze. My rifle was next to me, but my hand shook as I reached for it. The steps came closer, circling halfway around the tent. I could hear breathing, too slow, heavy breathing. I lay there for what felt like forever, barely daring to move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound faded away into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I got out of the tent and checked around. There were footprints again, larger and clearer this time. They weren't boots. They weren't animal tracks either. The shape was human, but longer, wider, and pressed deep into the dirt like whoever or whatever had been out there was heavy. The steps circled my tent, then wandered off into the trees. By midday, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was some hunter passing by in the dark. Maybe I imagined the breathing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went out again with my rifle, thinking maybe I'd move camp the next morning, go a few miles back toward the truck. I didn't see a single elk that day, and the woods felt different, too quiet, like the sound had been drained out of everything. When I came back to camp at dusk, I saw the tent flap open. I knew I'd zipped it before I left. My stomach dropped. Inside, my sleeping bag was half pulled out, my gear scattered. Nothing was taken, but everything had been touched. The ground around the tent was covered in the same tracks, overlapping, pressed into the dirt in strange, uneven patterns. I packed what I could and decided I wasn't spending another night there. But it was already too dark to hike all the way back to the truck. I had to stay one more night. That night, I didn't light a fire. I wanted to stay quiet, unseen. I sat in the dark with the rifle in my lap, listening. Hours passed. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again, those same footsteps, slow and dragging. This time, they came from the direction of the trees behind me. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I could hear breathing again, louder, rough, almost like someone who'd been running. I sat frozen, staring at the thin nylon wall in front of me, waiting for it to move. Didn't. After a long moment, the sound faded again, and the woods went silent. I waited until the first trace of light touched the sky, then I packed everything. Didn't even bother rolling up the tent properly. I just stuffed it in the bag and started walking. I didn't stop, didn't eat, didn't rest. I followed my GPS back to the truck, checking behind me every few minutes. The woods felt like they were watching me. When I finally reached the dirt road, the relief hit so hard I almost dropped to my knees. But as I got closer to the truck, I saw something that made my chest go cold. There were prints in the mud near the driver's door, the same long, human-like ones. They went around the truck twice, then led back into the woods. My windows were fogged from the morning cold, but one of them had a smear across it, like a handprint dragged along the glass. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. I didn't look in the mirrors until I was miles down the road. When I finally did, the forest was just a dark line fading behind me. I never went back there again. I still hunt, but never alone and never that deep. I told myself for months it had to be some person, maybe a drifter, maybe someone living off the grid. But no matter how I tried to reason it, I couldn't explain those footprints or the way it moved, or how it always came when it was darkest and quietest. Every year when October rolls around, I think about that trip. I still see that image of the fogged window with the long handprint smeared across it. I can still feel that breath outside the tent. And no matter how many times I tell myself it was just a man out there, something in me knows it wasn't just someone passing by. It was something that had been watching me the whole time, waiting for me to leave its woods. It was early October 2014 when I decided to spend a weekend camping alone on an old family-owned farm in northern Minnesota. My uncle had bought the place years ago, but it had been left mostly unused since he passed. The land stretched wide and open with rough fields, a half-collapsed barn, and patches of dense forest that looked darker than they should have, even in daylight. I had been working long hours in the city, and I wanted a break. Some silence, fresh air, and maybe a little hunting. The farm was isolated enough that I wouldn't hear a car for miles. Felt like the right place to clear my head. I drove out in an old Ford truck, packed with a tent, a rifle, some canned food, and a small cooler of water and beer. The drive took almost 5 hours from Minneapolis, most of it through empty roads lined with yellowing trees. By the time I reached the property, the sun was already low, spreading that soft orange light across the empty fields. I parked near the gate where the gravel turned into dirt and walked the rest of the way in. The air smelled like cold earth and pine needles. The old farmhouse stood silent. The windows were boarded up, and the roof had started to sag inward. The barn nearby had half its roof missing, and tall weeds had taken over the place. I didn't plan to sleep inside. I set up my tent about 50 yards away from the barn, on a patch of flat ground beside a group of oak trees. Felt safe there, not too close to the woods, not too exposed. I got a fire going and cooked some sausages on a small grill I brought with me. The sound of the crackling fire mixed with the distant hum of crickets. The air got cold fast once the sun disappeared. I wrapped myself in my jacket and watched the stars come out. Out here, they looked sharper than they ever did in the city. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you realize how much noise you live with every day. I went to sleep around 10, zipped up in my sleeping bag, the fire still glowing faintly outside. Sometime in the night, I woke up to the sound of something moving near the tent. Not close enough to touch it, but near enough that I could hear grass bending. My first thought was a deer, maybe a raccoon. I stayed still, listening. The steps were slow and uneven, like someone trying not to make noise. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, but I didn't unzip the tent. The sound stopped. I waited a few seconds, my heart hammering, but nothing followed. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably a deer and went back to sleep. The next morning, frost covered the ground. The air burned in my lungs when I stepped outside. I noticed a few footprints near my tent, human ones. They weren't mine. The boots were smaller and narrower, maybe a size 8. They led from the barn toward the trees. I stared at them for a long time, trying to think of an explanation. Maybe someone was passing through the property. Maybe an old hunter. Still, it bothered me that I hadn't seen or heard anyone else around. I spent most of the day walking around the fields and woods with my rifle. The land sloped down toward a dried-out creek that wound behind the barn. I found some old farming tools scattered around, rusted through and half buried in dirt. A broken plow, a wheelbarrow, even a tractor missing its tires. The deeper I went into the woods, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the still, heavy air that made me feel watched. Around noon, I found a small trail that I didn't remember from before. It was narrow, overgrown, but it looked like someone had been walking it recently. Branches were bent, and I saw what looked like footprints in the mud. I followed it for a while, maybe half a mile, until it ended at an old hunting blind. The wood was gray and falling apart, but there were signs someone had been using it. An empty can of beans, a half-burned cigarette butt, and a plastic bottle. The strange part was that the can and the cigarette looked fresh, like from the last few days. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept glancing toward the trees, expecting to see someone standing there. I built the fire higher, more for comfort than warmth. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises, a branch snapping, leaves crunching, but it was always far enough away that I couldn't tell where it came from. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed of footsteps circling my tent. By the third day, I started thinking about leaving early. The silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like the place was holding its breath. I packed some things into the truck, but before I left, I wanted to check the barn one last time. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to be sure nobody else was there. The barn was colder inside than the air outside. Dust floated through the thin beams of light coming in through the broken roof. The smell of rot and animal waste hung heavy. In one corner, I found a pile of old blankets and empty food wrappers. Someone had definitely been sleeping there recently. My stomach twisted when I noticed the small pile of bones nearby. Animal bones picked clean. I didn't want to think too much about it. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint shuffle behind the barn. I froze. Through a crack in the wood, I saw movement, just a shadow passing by, quick and low. I didn't wait to see more. I slipped out the front and walked fast toward my truck, trying not to run. The whole way, I could feel that tight pressure between my shoulder blades, like someone was watching me. When I reached the truck, I saw something that made my blood go cold. The driver's door was open. I knew I had closed it the night before. On the seat, one of my water bottles was missing, and a few crumbs from a granola bar were scattered around. It was a small thing, but it told me everything I needed to know. Someone had been there, maybe while I was sleeping just a few yards away. I started the truck fast and drove down the dirt road, not caring about the bumps or ruts. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of someone standing near the barn. Too far to see clearly, but it was a person. Small frame, pale clothes, just standing there watching the truck disappear. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't call anyone, didn't tell anyone about it for weeks. I just went home and tried to forget it. Later that winter, I looked up the property records. I found out that the land had been reported once for trespassing, about 3 years before my trip. Some local farmer had seen lights there at night and called it in. The sheriff checked, found nothing, and dropped it. Nobody ever figured out who was living there. I never went back. The tent, the grill, even my cooler, I left it all there. Sometimes I still think about the footprints, the things in the barn, and that open truck door. I know what I saw and I know what I heard. There's no way to explain it away. Someone was living on that property, hiding in those woods, watching me from the dark. And the worst part is, I'll never know how long they'd been there before I showed up. or how close they came to my tent while I slept. It had been raining since the afternoon, the kind of cold, steady rain that soaked through everything no matter how well you thought you packed. I was camping alone in the woods near Mount Jefferson in Oregon. It was late September of 2014, and the weather had turned colder than I expected. The air had that wet pine smell mixed with smoke from my small campfire, which kept dying every few minutes because of the drizzle. I'd planned this trip for weeks, 2 nights off-grid, away from everything, no phone, no people, no noise, just me, the forest, and the quiet. By the time it got dark, the rain had turned heavier, tapping against the tent like thousands of small pebbles. I had my sleeping bag unrolled and a small propane lantern hooked to the top pole of the tent, casting a weak yellow glow. My boots sat by the entrance, muddy, and my jacket hung beside them, dripping slowly onto the ground sheet. I could hear the wind pushing through the trees outside, branches creaking, pine needles brushing against the nylon walls of the tent every now and then. I wasn't scared, at least not yet. I was used to camping alone. I had done it dozens of times, but there was something different about that night. The forest didn't sound right. Usually, even in rain, you can hear the faint calls of night birds or the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. That night, there was nothing but the rain and the wind. It was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow, like the woods were holding their breath. Around 10 p.m., I turned off the lantern and lay back, listening. The rain seemed to calm a little, shifting from a steady pour to softer drips from the trees. I was almost asleep when I heard something move outside. It wasn't the kind of sound you could mistake for wind. It was slow and heavy, something pressing into the wet ground. At first, I thought it might be a deer. I'd seen a few earlier in the day when I was hiking down the trail. But then it came closer, too close. The sound of footsteps, wet boots squelching softly in the mud. I froze. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I had no reason to expect anyone else out there. The nearest campsite was about 2 miles down the trail, and I hadn't seen another car parked at the trailhead when I came in. Whoever it was shouldn't have been there. I stayed still, breathing through my mouth so I wouldn't make any sound. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I could see a faint shadow through the nylon from the lantern's fading glow. It looked like someone standing upright, maybe 6 feet tall. I could make out the shape of legs, a slight bend like they were leaning forward. I waited for a sound, anything, but it was silent again. I don't know how long I lay there like that, not moving, staring at that faint outline. My hands were shaking, and I could feel sweat even though it was cold. After what felt like forever, the shadow moved away. I listened as the wet footsteps faded into the trees. I stayed still for a few more minutes, trying to convince myself it was just a hiker who got lost or maybe someone passing by. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Nobody would be wandering around in the middle of the forest during a storm at night. I didn't sleep. Every sound made me flinch. Around midnight, the rain picked up again, hammering against the tent so loud I could barely hear myself think. Then I heard it again, the footsteps. They were slower this time and closer than before. I reached quietly for the flashlight near my sleeping bag, clicked it on, and shined it toward the tent wall. The shadow was there again, standing in the same place as before. My chest tightened. The person wasn't moving. They were just standing there, a few feet away, staring at my tent. The rain made it hard to tell, but I could hear the faint sound of breathing, heavy, unsteady. I wanted to yell, to ask who it was, but I couldn't make myself do it. My throat felt locked. Then I heard the sound of metal, like something scraping. My stomach dropped. It sounded like a knife or some kind of tool being dragged slowly against something hard. That was enough. I unzipped the sleeping bag, grabbed the flashlight and my small hatchet, and got out of the tent in one motion. The cold rain hit me like ice. My light swung across the trees, the wet ground, and my campfire pit filled with water. There was no one there, no sign of anyone at all. The ground was a mess of mud and pine needles, and I could see my own boot prints from earlier, but nothing fresh. I turned in a full circle, scanning the tree line. The rain blurred my vision, and the beam of my light kept reflecting off the water droplets in the air. The forest was silent again. No breathing, no footsteps, nothing. After a few minutes, I went back into the tent, zipped it tight, and sat there gripping the hatchet in my lap. I didn't even bother lying down again. I just sat and waited. Sometime during the night, exhaustion hit me. I must have dozed off sitting up because the next thing I remember was waking up to faint daylight filtering through the wet fabric of the tent. It was still raining, but softer now, more like a drizzle. My hands were stiff from gripping the hatchet all night. I felt stupid for getting so scared, but something about that night still didn't sit right with me. When I stepped outside, I froze. There were footprints, not mine, bigger, deeper, and fresher than any I had seen the day before. They circled the tent twice, then led off into the trees. I followed them a few steps before they disappeared into the thick mud near a slope that went down toward the creek. I stopped there, staring into the forest. The fog was hanging low, making everything look pale and distant. I packed up as fast as I could. My fingers were numb, and my stomach felt tight the whole time. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just stuffed everything into my pack, took down the tent, and started heading back to the trailhead. The rain had picked up again, and the trail was slick and quiet. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone walking behind me. When I finally reached my truck, I stood there for a minute, just staring at it through the rain, feeling that heavy relief that comes when you know you're finally leaving something behind. Before I got in, I glanced back down the trail one last time. There were no figures, no movement, just the gray trees fading into fog. It wasn't until I got home later that day and cleaned out my gear that I found something that made my stomach drop again. On the back of my tent, near where my head had been while I slept, there was a long, thin scratch, like a knife mark, cut deep enough to slice through the first layer of fabric. I never went back to that area again. For weeks after, I kept waking up at night thinking I heard footsteps outside my window. Maybe it was just my mind replaying that night, or maybe something really had followed me out of those woods. Either way, I stopped camping alone after that. The forest stopped feeling like a place of peace. Now, when it rains at night, that sound, the slow, steady tapping against the walls, always brings me back to that night in Oregon, sitting in the dark, listening to footsteps outside my tent that shouldn't have been there. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip to northern Arizona. I was 28 at the time, living in Flagstaff, working long hours at a warehouse job that left me drained every day. I'd been wanting some quiet, something to clear my head for a while. The idea of spending a few days out in nature sounded perfect. No noise, no people, no phone service. Just me, my tent, and the quiet. I drove out early one Friday morning, heading toward a spot I'd found online near Canyon del Muerto, not too far from Chinle. The area wasn't an official campsite, just open land with rough dirt trails. The red rock cliffs there looked like something from another planet, carved by wind and time. I packed light, a small tent, sleeping bag, water, some food, and a small cooler. It was supposed to be just 2 nights, maybe 3 if it felt right. When I got there, I found a flat patch of ground near the base of a canyon wall. The air smelled like dust and pine sap. The sun was heavy and hot, and everything around me shimmered slightly in the heat. I set up camp, built a small fire ring from stones, and made sure my car was parked close enough to reach if I needed to leave fast. I didn't plan on hiking too far. I mostly wanted to relax, take a few photos, maybe write a little in my notebook. The first day went smoothly. I walked a bit along the canyon edge, watching hawks circle high above. In the evening, I cooked some canned beans over the fire and watched the stars come out. It was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat if I stayed still. There were moments where it almost felt too quiet, like the silence was pressing against my ears. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent and fell asleep quickly. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps outside. Not the distant kind, close, crunching softly in the dirt just beyond the thin nylon wall of my tent. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped right outside the tent. Then there was this sound like someone breathing. Slow, uneven breaths, just a few feet away. My skin went cold. I waited, frozen, trying to figure out what to do. The breathing went on for maybe 30 seconds, then faded. I heard a few more slow steps moving away toward the dark canyon. I didn't sleep again that night. I just lay there until the sun started to come up, gripping the flashlight in my hand. In the morning, I stepped outside and checked around the tent. The ground was covered in loose sand and dust, so footprints didn't stay well. But near the edge of camp, I saw something that looked like a human print, barefoot but wrong. The toes looked spread apart, uneven, like they'd pressed too deep into the dirt. I told myself it was just a warped coyote track and tried not to think about it. That whole day, I couldn't shake the unease. Even when I walked out toward the canyon edge, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The air felt different, heavier somehow. By afternoon, clouds started forming, and I could hear distant thunder echoing through the rocks. I decided I'd stay just one more night, then pack up early the next morning. That evening, I built my fire earlier than usual. The light helped calm me. I ate quickly and double-checked that my car keys and flashlight were inside the tent. The wind started to pick up, making a low whistling sound through the cracks in the cliffs. As the sky darkened, the shapes of the rocks around camp started to blur together, shadows twisting in ways that made it hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. Sometime after 11, I heard movement again. This time it wasn't soft, it was steady, walking. I killed the fire down to embers and crouched inside the tent, listening. The steps stopped and started, circling slowly. It wasn't a four-legged animal. It sounded like someone walking on 2 feet, dragging one slightly like a limp. Every time I thought it had gone, it started again from another direction. My heart was hammering so loud I thought whoever, or whatever, it was might hear it. I reached for the zipper but froze when I heard something else. It was my name, low, drawn out, in a voice that almost sounded like mine, but not quite. Came from just outside the tent. That broke me. I unzipped the flap and burst out, shining my flashlight in every direction. The beam cut through the dust and wind, landing on nothing but empty space and scattered sagebrush. Then, maybe 30 feet away near the canyon's edge, the light caught movement. Something was standing there. At first, I thought it was a man, tall, skinny, long arms. But the longer I looked, the less it made sense. The figure moved wrong. Its limbs bent too sharply. It didn't stand steady. It twitched, like it was trying to remember how to balance. The head tilted, too slow, too deliberate, as if it was testing the movement. I couldn't see a face clearly, just pale skin and something like hair hanging down. Then, as I kept the light on it, it crouched down, fast, and vanished behind a rock. I didn't wait to see more. I ran straight to the car, fumbling the keys with shaking hands. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started it. The headlights came on, cutting across the camp. There was nothing there, just my tent flapping in the wind and the glowing eyes of my cooler reflecting light. I drove down the dirt trail faster than I should have, rocks bouncing under the tires, my whole body trembling. It took nearly 40 minutes before I hit the paved road. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in Chinle around 2 a.m. I sat there in the parking lot, staring at my hands, still shaking. I didn't call anyone. I just sat until dawn, then drove home in silence. When I got back to Flagstaff, I noticed scratches on the back of my car. Long, thin marks that hadn't been there before. 3 parallel lines like something had dragged claws or nails across the trunk. I told myself it was from the brush on the drive out, that maybe I'd scraped against something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. For weeks after that, I kept replaying what I saw. That figure, how it moved, how it seemed to copy my own shape. I thought about how it had said my name, in a voice that sounded like me. I stopped camping after that. I even sold my tent and gear. At night, when the wind blows against my window, sometimes it makes that same low, whistling sound I heard in the canyon. And every time, my stomach knots up, remembering the way that thing turned its head toward me. People online call them skinwalkers, some kind of old story from the Southwest. I don't know what I believe. All I know is that I saw something human, but not human enough. Something that watched me all night and waited for me to step out of that tent. And I know that if I had, just a few seconds sooner, maybe I wouldn't have made it back at all. I went camping alone in the fall of 2019, up near a place called Carter Ridge in northern Idaho. I had driven out there after a rough week at work, thinking a weekend in the quiet would clear my head. I'd done a lot of solo camping before, but this spot was new to me. It was one of those places you only hear about through word of mouth. Not on maps, not on any camping site listings. A guy I'd met once on a hiking trail told me about it, said it had some of the best sunrise views in the state. That was all I needed to hear. I left early Friday morning, packed with the basics: tent, food, small propane stove, flashlight, knife, and my old .22 rifle I usually brought along just in case of animals. The drive took most of the day. The road narrowed the deeper I went, changing from asphalt to gravel to a dirt path that looked like it hadn't seen many cars that year. By the time I parked and started walking, the sun was already dipping low, throwing long shadows through the trees. The air had that crisp, dry chill you only get in early October. I found a small clearing about half a mile off the trail, surrounded by pine and birch. It felt tucked away, quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and ate canned chili straight from the tin. There was something comforting about how simple everything felt. The sound of the fire cracking, the cold air on my face, the smell of wood smoke mixing with pine sap. When it got dark, it got really dark. The kind of darkness where your flashlight beam looks like it's being swallowed whole. I didn't mind at first. I'd camped in worse places, slept through storms, heard coyotes scream in the distance. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the ground still cold beneath me even with the mat, and drifted off. I woke up around 2 a.m. It wasn't any noise that woke me, at least not one I could point out. It was that strange, instinctive feeling that something's not right. My heart was already beating fast before I even opened my eyes. I stayed still, listening. The forest was dead silent. Not a single insect, not a rustle, not even the faint groan of trees shifting in the wind. That kind of silence is rare in the woods. It always means something. After a minute, I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps just outside my tent. The sound of weight pressing down on the pine needles. Too heavy to be a raccoon or rabbit. I held my breath, my whole body stiff. The steps stopped right near my head. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves shifting as if someone was standing there, just breathing quietly. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Every part of me screamed to unzip the tent, shine my flashlight, yell something, but I couldn't. It was like my body locked up, frozen between fear and logic. The sound lingered for what felt like forever, then slowly moved away. I listened until it disappeared completely into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, staring up at the dim glow of the tent fabric. When daylight came, everything looked normal again. I checked around my tent. No boot prints that I could see, but the pine needles were thick. They could have easily covered tracks. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was maybe a deer that had wandered close. Still, something about it didn't feel right. Deer don't walk slow like that. They move quick, cautious. Whatever I heard was deliberate. The day passed quietly. I went down to a nearby creek, filled up my water bottle, and hiked a bit to take pictures. It was beautiful up there. Wide open sky, gold leaves scattered across the forest floor, the smell of damp earth everywhere. By the time I got back, the sun was already slipping down again. I rebuilt the fire, ate some jerky, and sat by the flames as the light faded. The woods around me looked different at night. Every tree seemed to stretch taller, the spaces between them darker. I could feel that uneasy silence creeping back again. Around 9 p.m., I heard something faint, far off at first, then closer, like a stick snapping, then another. I turned off my flashlight and just listened. This time, the steps weren't random. They were circling, slow, steady crunches moving in an arc around my camp. I could barely see anything, just the faint outline of trees under a half moon. My fire was low, barely glowing. I sat completely still, gripping the rifle across my lap, trying not to breathe too loud. The sound stopped again, just like the night before. I stayed up till dawn, eyes wide open. When I finally stepped out, there were faint impressions in the dirt about 20 feet from my tent. Not clear boot prints, but patches where the needles looked compressed, disturbed. I could see it was human-shaped enough to know I wasn't imagining it. I should have packed up right then. I thought about it, but I told myself maybe some hunter had wandered through by mistake. The road wasn't far. It was public land. Anyone could be out here. That's what I told myself. That afternoon, I hiked a bit farther up the ridge to get a view. From the top, I could see miles of forest, endless green rolling into blue hills. I noticed a faint wisp of smoke far off, maybe a mile away, thin and gray, rising just above the tree-line. Looked like another campfire. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. At least I wasn't alone out here, but at the same time, something about it made my stomach turn. By sunset, I'd made up my mind to leave in the morning. I didn't want to hike back to the truck in the dark, but I wanted out. I packed most of my stuff early, keeping just what I needed for the night. Sometime past midnight, I woke again. No sound this time, not at first. Then a faint dragging noise, like something being pulled across the ground. My whole body tensed. It was close, maybe just beyond the edge of the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, and without thinking, I flicked the light on. For a split second, I saw something. A person, or what looked like one, standing between two trees wearing what looked like dark clothing or maybe just covered in dirt. The light caught their face for half a heartbeat. Pale, dirty, eyes reflecting the beam. Then they turned and moved fast into the woods. Not running, just fast enough that by the time I blinked, they were gone. I sat there shaking, my throat dry, heart pounding so hard it hurt. I didn't move again until the first light of morning. When I finally stepped out, the first thing I noticed was something hanging on the tree near my camp. A small piece of cloth tied to a branch, dark red, like an old shirt sleeve. It wasn't mine. I packed everything in a hurry, barely checking the tent, and hiked straight back toward the trail. My legs felt weak the whole way down. Every sound made me whip around, but I didn't see anyone. When I reached the dirt road, my truck was just as I'd left it. Except for one thing. On the driver's side window, there was a long, greasy handprint. Smudged. Human. I drove until I hit cell service, then stopped at a diner on the way to the next town. I told a guy there about it, just said I'd seen someone wandering near my camp. He looked at me and said, almost casually, that some drifters had been camping out near Carter Ridge the past month. Apparently, the sheriff had told folks to steer clear of that area after a couple of missing person reports came in late September. I didn't go back for the rest of my gear. My tent, stove, everything. I left it all there. Even now, I think about that night, about the sound of those footsteps, that still silence before they stopped near my head. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone anymore, and never anywhere that quiet. Because I've learned something, silence in the woods doesn't mean peace. It means something's listening. It had been raining for hours, the kind of slow, heavy rain that made everything feel colder than it actually was. I was camping alone in the northern part of Washington state, deep inside one of those dense forests where the trees stand so tall that even the wind sounds trapped between them. It was early October 2019, and I'd come out there for a 3-day solo trip, something I'd done a few times before. I liked the quiet, the isolation, the idea of being away from people, from phone signals, from traffic. But that night, the quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a warning I didn't understand. I had set up camp near a small creek that cut through the forest, a few miles from a dirt access road. My tent sat on a patch of relatively dry ground surrounded by thick pines, their branches heavy with rain. Everything around me was soaked. The ground, my boots, the tarp stretched above my small fire pit. Even the air felt wet. The rain hadn't stopped since the afternoon, and as night came down, it turned heavier, almost like it was trying to drown out every other sound. By 10 p.m., my small fire was dying. I was sitting on a log, wrapped in my damp jacket, trying to eat something quick before heading inside the tent. The water kept dripping from the edge of the tarp in steady beats. My flashlight hung from a low branch, throwing weak light over the muddy clearing. I could see the steam rising from the fire and the reflection of raindrops glinting across the wet surface of my camp gear. There was this uneasy feeling I couldn't shake off since the evening. I kept telling myself it was just the weather, the cold, the isolation, maybe even the sound of the forest shifting in the rain. But every few minutes, I'd glance toward the trees, half expecting to see something move. I never did. It was just blackness between the trunks. Around midnight, I finally crawled into the tent. My clothes were half wet, and the sleeping bag was cold when I got in. The rain hammered the fabric so loudly that I couldn't hear anything else, not even the creek that was only 20 yards away. I turned off my flashlight and lay there, trying to relax, but my mind wouldn't quiet down. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but the rain had eased to a light drizzle. It wasn't the weather that woke me, it was the silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong, like the world is holding its breath. I opened my eyes and just lay there, listening. The tent was almost pitch black except for faint light from the dying embers of the fire outside. Then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the rain or the forest. A soft thud, like a footstep on wet soil. Then another, slow, careful. It was coming from somewhere near the edge of the clearing. I froze completely, barely breathing. My first thought was that maybe it was a deer or maybe a bear wandering through. But the steps didn't sound like an animal. They were too steady, too deliberate. I reached slowly for my flashlight but stopped halfway. The zipper on my sleeping bag made the faintest sound, and instantly the steps stopped. The silence that followed felt endless. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, heavy and uneven. After maybe 30 seconds, the sound came again, closer this time. I could almost sense the weight of someone standing just outside the tent, on the other side of the thin nylon wall. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. The ground made a faint squelching noise as whoever or whatever it was shifted their weight. I didn't move. Then something brushed against the tent fabric near my feet. Light, almost like the back of a hand or the edge of clothing. It dragged slowly upward, tracing the outline of my leg through the fabric. I jerked my leg back instinctively, my pulse racing so fast I thought I'd pass out. The brushing stopped immediately. I didn't think. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, aiming the beam toward where I felt the touch. The light hit the wet nylon from inside, turning the whole tent wall into a glowing sheet. For a split second, I saw the faint outline of a figure standing outside. Broad shoulders, a hood or something dark over their head, standing still. No movement, just standing there. I froze. The figure didn't move away. I waited, my arm shaking, the flashlight beam trembling against the wall. Then, after what felt like forever, it slowly turned and walked away. The sound of steps fading into the trees was clear and calm, not hurried. I stayed like that for minutes, staring at the tent wall, waiting to hear something else. Nothing came, only the rain starting again, soft at first, then heavier. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the light on, sitting upright in the sleeping bag, gripping the handle of my hatchet the entire time. By dawn, the forest looked different. Wet mist hung between the trees, and everything was gray and still. I stepped outside, my clothes sticking to my skin from sweat and moisture. The ground was torn up with footprints, human ones. Barefoot, I realized, after kneeling down to look closer. They weren't large, maybe the size of a woman's foot, but there were several of them circling my tent and leading back into the woods. There was something else too. My food bag, which I'd hung from a branch near the creek, was gone. The rope was still swinging slightly, like it had been pulled not long ago. I followed the prints for about 30 feet before they disappeared into the mud and wet leaves. The rain had washed most of them away, but the direction was clear. They led deeper into the forest. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely stopping to check if I'd left anything behind. My hands shook while taking down the tent. I didn't even bother to dry anything. I just stuffed it all into my backpack and started walking back toward the access road. The forest felt even quieter than before. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my boots squelching through the mud. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach my truck. When I finally saw it through the trees, I felt this heavy mix of relief and exhaustion. The windshield was covered with leaves and rain, but as I got closer, I noticed something strange. There were muddy handprints on the driver's side door. Small ones, too small for my hands. They were smeared downward, like someone had pressed their palms against the glass and dragged them slowly before letting go. I stood there for a long time, rain dripping off my hood, just staring at the marks. Then I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The drive back felt endless. The forest road twisted through miles of wet trees, and every time I checked the mirror, I half expected to see someone standing in the road behind me. When I got home that afternoon, I unpacked everything in the garage. My gear smelled like damp wood and smoke. That night, while cleaning the tent, I found something stuck to the outside near where I'd seen the figure's outline. A small piece of cloth, torn, black, thin like the kind used in raincoats. It wasn't mine. I still don't know who or what that was out there. A hiker lost in the storm, maybe. Someone living off the grid, watching camps for supplies. But the barefoot prints, the quiet way they moved, the deliberate way they touched the tent, it didn't feel like someone just passing by. I never went back to that forest again. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never that deep in the woods. Even now, years later, when it rains at night and the sound hits the roof in that same steady rhythm, I find myself remembering that silence, the kind that comes right before you realize you're not alone. I went hunting alone once, deep in the forests of northern Montana, near the edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. It was late September 2018. The days were warm, but the nights were dropping close to freezing. I'd been planning that trip for months, saving up for a decent rifle scope and enough fuel to drive my old Chevy pickup out that far. I was 32 at the time, single, and tired of sitting behind a computer all week. Hunting was the one thing that helped me clear my head. That year, I wanted solitude, no buddies tagging along, no small talk, no distractions. Just quiet woods, cold air, and the steady rhythm of being alone in nature. The trailhead I chose was about an hour down a dirt road from the nearest town, a place called Sealy Lake. The road was rough, with potholes deep enough to hide your tire if you weren't careful. When I reached the trail, I parked near a bend where the forest closed in so tight you could barely see the sky. I hiked in about 4 miles before setting up camp beside a creek. The water was clear and fast-moving, loud enough to drown out the small sounds of the forest, which at first I liked. The air smelled of pine and wet soil, the kind of smell that lingers in your clothes for days. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a small meal over my portable stove, crawled into my sleeping bag, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. It wasn't exactly peaceful, but it was familiar. I've camped alone plenty of times before. I've heard coyotes, bears, even elk bugling close by. None of that really bothers me. But that night, sometime after midnight, I woke up for no reason. The kind of sudden waking that makes your body freeze before your mind catches up. I couldn't hear anything unusual, just the creak, but something felt off. I told myself it was probably the cold or maybe a dream I'd already forgotten. I forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I started hiking deeper into the valley. I followed a narrow game trail that ran parallel to the creek, then cut uphill toward a ridge that overlooked the basin. The higher I went, the quieter everything became. No birds, no insects, just wind and my boots crunching through dry grass. Around noon, I found what looked like fresh elk tracks. They led uphill toward a thicket of aspen trees. I followed them for about half an hour before they vanished into hard ground. I sat for a while, drank some water, and checked my map. That's when I noticed something strange. About 100 yards downhill, there was a small clearing I hadn't seen before. It looked like a campsite, but not a maintained one, just a flat patch of ground surrounded by brush. From that distance, I could make out a few dark shapes on the ground. I figured it was maybe an old hunter's camp or some backpackers who left trash behind. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I got closer, I saw the remains of a fire ring made of stones, cold and filled with ash. There were scraps of plastic, a dented pot, and what looked like the frame of a small tent, bent, torn, and half buried in dirt. The fabric had faded, but it hadn't been there long enough to rot completely. What struck me most was the quiet. No birds, no movement. Even the wind seemed to avoid that spot. I found a few scattered items, an old boot, a canteen, and a shredded backpack. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, or something had gotten to them. I tried not to think too much about it. I hiked back to my own camp that evening. The air felt heavier somehow. I couldn't shake the image of that ruined tent. When I got back, the light was already fading. I gathered some firewood, boiled water for dinner, and sat beside the flames until it got fully dark. The woods came alive again. Owls calling, branches creaking, small things moving through the brush. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Every sound made my head turn. Later that night, I heard something that made my stomach drop. It wasn't an animal noise. It was the metallic click of something striking metal. I froze. The sound came from the direction of my truck, which was about 4 miles back down the trail. It didn't make sense. There was nothing metallic near my camp except my gear, all within arm's reach. The clicking came again, faint but clear, like someone trying to open a latch or tapping metal with a knife. Then it stopped completely. I stayed awake most of that night, sitting upright in my tent with my rifle resting across my knees. Every so often I'd hear twigs snap, faint footsteps that never came closer. By dawn, I was exhausted. I told myself I'd pack up and head out early, but part of me wanted to stay just one more day to prove I wasn't scared. I left camp after breakfast, deciding to check a meadow about 2 miles north. It was the kind of place elk like to graze early in the morning. But when I got there, something caught my eye again. Near the treeline, there was a shape that didn't belong, a man, or at least I thought it was. He was standing still, half behind a tree. From where I stood, it looked like he was wearing dark clothes, maybe a hood or a hat. I raised my binoculars, but by the time I focused, he was gone. Just trees swaying in the wind. I tried to laugh it off. Probably another hunter. But the nearest camp I'd passed on the way in was over 15 miles south. Still, I didn't want to overthink it. I stayed in that meadow for another hour, but my focus was gone. I kept checking the trees, listening for movement that never came. When I got back to camp later that afternoon, I found something that made my legs go weak. The zipper on my tent was open halfway, and my sleeping bag had been pulled out onto the dirt. My food bag, which I'd hung high on a branch, was lying on the ground, slashed open, not torn by claws, cut. Clean lines like with a knife. I didn't find any footprints nearby, but the ground was hard and covered in pine needles. That was enough for me. I didn't even bother to cook. I stuffed my gear into my pack, doused the fire, and started heading back to my truck while there was still light. The trail felt longer than before. Every step, I kept glancing behind me. The forest felt alive in the worst way, like it was watching. Halfway back, I thought I heard something following me. Slow, careful steps matching mine. I'd stop and they'd stop. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks after 2 nights of little sleep. When I finally reached the spot where I'd parked, the sun was dipping behind the ridge. The truck was there, but something about it looked off. As I got closer, I saw the driver's side door slightly open. I always locked it. Always. My heart started pounding. I stood still for almost a full minute, staring at that open door, trying to decide what to do. I forced myself forward, rifle raised, checking inside. Nothing. Everything was still there, my sleeping bag, extra fuel can, even the food cooler. But the glove box was open and my maps were gone. I didn't think. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. The sound of it roaring to life was the only thing that felt real in that moment. I drove out of there faster than I should have, bouncing hard over the potholes. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where the trees finally opened up. I remember pulling over and just sitting there for a while, shaking. When I got back to town, I went straight to the ranger station. I told them what I'd seen, the old campsite, the noises, the open truck. The ranger nodded slowly. He said people went missing in that area sometimes, especially off-trail. He didn't say much else, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he'd heard similar stories before. I never went back there again. I still hunt, but never alone and never that far in. Every now and then I think about that ruined tent and whoever left it there. Maybe they were just careless. Maybe they weren't alone either. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods and the wind goes quiet all at once, I remember that feeling, the weight of being watched by something human, but not friendly. And I think about how lucky I was to leave before dark. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip through Austria. I had just turned 27, recently quit a job I hated, and needed a break from the noise of people. I flew into Vienna, rented a small used camper van, and drove west toward the Salzkammergut region. The idea was simple: a week of quiet, away from cities, staying by lakes and forests where I could clear my head. On the third day, I arrived near Lake Hallstatt. It was beautiful, calm water surrounded by steep rocky cliffs and thick green forests. Most people stayed near the town, but I wanted privacy, so I drove several kilometers around the lake until I found a narrow dirt road that led deeper into the trees. It wasn't an official campsite, just a small clearing by the water with enough space to park my van and pitch a small tent beside it. There were no signs of people around, no fire pits, no litter, nothing. Just the sound of water and the distant cry of some bird echoing through the cliffs. That first evening was peaceful. The sun set behind the mountains, turning the lake dark blue and the sky pink. I cooked a simple meal, canned beans and bread, and sat on a folding chair near the water. The air smelled of wet pine and moss. I stayed up until it was completely dark, listening to insects and the quiet ripple of the water. When I finally went inside the tent, the silence felt heavy, but it was the kind of silence I had been craving. The next morning, I woke up to light rain. I stayed in the van for most of the morning, reading and making coffee on my small gas stove. The sound of the rain tapping on the roof was comforting. By afternoon, the rain stopped, and I decided to go for a walk through the forest. The ground was muddy, and the air was cool and damp. I followed what looked like an old hiking trail, probably used by locals years ago. After walking for maybe 20 minutes, I noticed something odd. A single gray scarf tied around a tree trunk. It looked old, soaked from the rain with frayed ends. I thought maybe someone had dropped it and another hiker tied it there so they could find it later. But the weird thing was that I didn't see any footprints, not even fresh ones. The mud would have shown them clearly. I kept walking, and a few minutes later I found another piece of clothing. A glove this time, black leather, lying on a rock. That's when I started feeling uneasy. There was no one else around, and I hadn't seen another car on the road since yesterday. I decided to turn back to camp. As I got closer to the clearing, I noticed something else. Across the lake, maybe 200 meters away, there was someone standing near the water. It was hard to see clearly through the mist, but it looked like a woman wearing a long beige coat. She was completely still, facing the lake. I thought she might be fishing or taking pictures, but I didn't see any gear, just her motionless, staring at the water. I watched her for a moment and then went back to my tent. When I looked again a few minutes later, she was gone. I told myself it was nothing, probably a local out for a walk, but the image of her standing there stayed in my head. That night, I didn't sleep well. The forest made strange noises, branches snapping, the wind moving through the trees, water splashing lightly against the rocks. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of my van. It was soft, like fabric dragging on metal. I froze and listened. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I waited, staring at the dark outline of the tent wall, hearing only my heartbeat. Then I slowly unzipped the flap just a little, enough to look outside. There was nothing there, only the reflection of the moon on the wet ground. I checked around with my flashlight, but the trees made long shadows that moved whenever I shifted the light. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a deer brushing past. I closed the flap and stayed awake for hours before I finally fell asleep again. The next morning, I noticed footprints near the van, small, narrow ones, not like boots or hiking shoes. They looked like someone had been walking barefoot, but the shape was too long. The toes spread oddly. They led from the trees to the lake and disappeared at the edge of the water. I decided I'd leave that day. The place was starting to feel off. I packed my gear, but before I got in the van, I saw her again, the same woman. She was standing farther down the shoreline, closer this time, maybe 50 meters away. I could see her more clearly now. Her coat looked dirty, and her hair was dark, hanging wet against her shoulders. She wasn't moving, just watching the water again. Something about how still she was made my stomach tighten. I waited for her to move, maybe wave, maybe turn, but she didn't. I started the van, hoping the sound would make her notice me, but she didn't react. As I drove off, I kept checking the mirrors. When I reached the small road leading back to the main highway, I saw her one last time through the trees. This time she wasn't by the lake. She was standing right on the dirt road, facing my direction. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I knew she was looking at me. I pressed the gas harder and didn't stop until I was back in Hallstatt town. I booked a room in a small guest house that night. It felt strange to be around people again, like I had been gone longer than just a few days. I showered, ate, tried to convince myself it was all just bad timing and my imagination filling the gaps. But when I went outside to smoke before bed, I saw something that made my chest tighten again. On the van's side window, faintly visible under the streetlight, there was a long streak across the glass. It looked like someone had run their fingers through the dirt and rain residue. 5 lines, uneven, slightly curved, like a hand had pressed there. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying everything in my head. The footprints, the scarf, the glove, the way she stood still like she was waiting for something. The next morning, I went to a small police station to report it, not as a crime, but just to let them know that there might be someone wandering around that part of the lake. The officer listened but didn't seem too concerned. He said people sometimes lived off-grid in the woods there, especially older women who didn't want to be found. He said a few locals had seen someone like that before, always alone, always by the water. I asked if they ever talked to her. He shrugged, said she never spoke to anyone, just stared. Sometimes she disappeared for months. Then someone else would spot her again near another part of the lake. I left Austria the next day. The trip that I thought would clear my mind ended up doing the opposite. I still remember how still she was, the way she never moved, never reacted, like she wasn't waiting for me to notice her, but for something else entirely. A few weeks later, back home, I developed the photos I took during the trip. Most were normal mountains, trees, the van by the lake. But in one picture, taken that second morning, I noticed something in the background. Near the waterline, almost hidden in the mist, was a faint figure. Small, distant, barely visible. It looked like someone in a long coat standing by the lake, facing away. I didn't take another camping trip after that. I still go hiking sometimes, but only during the day and never alone. Every time I see someone standing too still near the water, I feel that same tightness in my stomach again. The memory of that woman, motionless, watching the lake as if waiting for something that never came. And sometimes, when I look at my van's window under the right light, I swear I can still see those faint, uneven marks of her hand, as if she had touched it once, quietly, before walking back into the trees. It was late September of 2017, somewhere deep in the northern woods of Montana. I was 28 back then, a few years into working a desk job that drained the life out of me day after day. The plan was to take a week off, drive north and just get lost for a bit. Clear my head, breathe some real air, and remind myself what quiet actually sounded like. I had done small camping trips before, but this time I wanted real isolation. No campgrounds, no marked trails, no people. Just me, my tent, and the kind of silence that could only exist miles away from civilization. I parked my old gray Tacoma off a dirt road that barely qualified as a road and hiked about 2 miles in, carrying everything on my back. Tent, food, rifle, the basics. It was late afternoon by the time I found a good spot near a small creek. The area was surrounded by tall pines and birch trees that swayed slightly in the wind. The ground was damp but flat, and I could hear the distant sound of water running down rocks, steady and calm. Felt right. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and lit a small fire before dark settled in. It was one of those nights where the air feels heavier than usual, cold but not freezing. I cooked a small meal, just beans and jerky, ate and leaned back against a log. The fire crackled softly, and all I could hear beyond it was the faint rustle of wind through branches and the occasional creak of the forest shifting. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you feel small but safe. Around midnight, the rain started. Not a storm, just a steady, cold drizzle that drummed lightly on the tent fabric. I woke up to the sound and zipped the flap tighter. The air inside was damp and smelled like wet nylon. I listened to the rain for a while before drifting back to sleep. But something woke me again later, something different. It wasn't the rain. At first, it sounded like a slow, uneven step. Not close, but not far either. The kind of sound that cuts through every other noise because it doesn't belong. It would crunch once, then stop for a long moment, then crunch again. I held still and listened harder. Maybe it was an animal. That made sense. But it wasn't consistent with how animals usually moved. It was too careful. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just branches shifting under the rain, or maybe a deer wandering nearby. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was circling. The steps weren't in one direction. I could hear them faintly move around, like something or someone was keeping distance but moving with purpose. I lay there for what felt like hours, heart thudding so loud I swore it echoed in the tent. Eventually, the sound stopped completely, and I forced myself to believe it was over. By morning, the rain had stopped. Everything outside glistened with water, and fog hung low across the ground. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. My boots sank slightly into the soft earth. The forest smelled fresh and clean. But then I saw them, tracks. Not boots, bare feet, human. They weren't large, maybe a man's size 9, but the shape was clear. Toes. Hail. The prints circled my tent in uneven spacing like someone had been walking around slowly. There were at least a dozen of them, pressed deep enough to show they were made recently, probably when the ground was still wet from the rain. A chill went straight through me. I stood there just staring at them, trying to think of an explanation that didn't involve another person walking barefoot through the woods in the middle of the night. It didn't make sense. I didn't hear any vehicles, didn't see any other camps or trails nearby. I tried to convince myself it could have been an old set of prints washed out by the rain, but the shape was too clear for that. I packed up a little faster than I'd planned and decided to move deeper in. Maybe 5 or 6 miles. It felt stupid even as I did it, but part of me thought maybe it would ease the feeling of being watched. I didn't want to go back toward the road yet. I just wanted a new spot, further from whatever or whoever had been near my tent. By late afternoon, I found a new clearing not far from the edge of a steep ridge that dropped down to a valley. The view was wide open, and the wind was stronger up there. I figured it would be harder for anyone to sneak up on me with all the open space. I set up camp again, made another small fire, and tried to shake the unease. But as the sun went down, the woods changed again. The sound of birds faded first, then even the wind seemed to quiet. I could feel the same heaviness in the air as the night before, that thick stillness that presses against your skin. I kept the fire going longer this time, staring into the flames just to keep from thinking too much. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a low scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground, slow and steady. Came from behind the ridge, somewhere down in the dark. I froze, holding my breath, listening. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again, closer. I turned off my small flashlight and crouched low, letting my eyes adjust to the faint moonlight. The sound came again, closer still. I could barely make out a shape moving near the tree line below, something upright. For a moment I thought maybe it was a bear standing, but it didn't move like one. The outline was thin, long, not bulky like an animal. It stopped near a fallen log and crouched down. I couldn't see details, but I could hear small sounds, like breathing, faint and uneven. I don't know how long I stayed there, crouched and staring, but the thing didn't move for what felt like forever. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my flashlight. Then suddenly, it stood up again, slowly, almost stiffly, and it turned not toward the forest but directly toward me. Even from that distance, I could tell it saw me. I don't know how, but I felt it, that frozen kind of fear that grips every muscle. I ducked behind a tree and waited. I didn't hear it move after that, not for a long time. When I finally peeked again, it was gone. The rest of the night was endless. Every noise made my heart jump. I barely slept. By dawn, I was done. I packed everything, threw it into my bag without caring how it fit, and started hiking back toward the truck. The woods were damp again, fog still hanging low, and every step sounded too loud. When I reached the area where I had first camped, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. There were new prints again, bare feet, leading in the same direction I had gone, like someone had followed the path I took. I didn't stop moving. My back ached, my hands were shaking, and I could barely breathe by the time I reached the truck. The driver's side door was muddy, smeared with handprints. Wet, dark mud streaked across the handle and window. Not animal marks, not random splatter, full handprints. I got inside, locked the doors, and just sat there for a long time, staring ahead. The forest around me looked calm, silent, like nothing had ever happened. I started the engine and drove until I hit the main road, not stopping once. I never figured out who or what was out there. I told myself it was probably some drifter, maybe someone living off-grid, maybe just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't random. Someone had followed me, watched me, walked barefoot through freezing mud in the middle of the night to circle my tent. I never went back to the woods after that. The gear sat in my garage for months before I finally sold it. Sometimes, though, when it rains at night and I hear that same soft, steady tapping against the roof, I still think about those footprints and the quiet shape that stood at the edge of the trees, watching me from the dark. It was late September 2016. I was 27 at the time, living in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I had been camping alone for years. I always liked being out in the open desert, far from everything, just quiet, open space, and that feeling of being small under the endless sky. That weekend, I drove out toward the Navajo Nation area, near the borderlands where the dry lands stretched for miles. I wasn't in any marked campground, just an open patch of land I'd found through a friend's suggestion years ago. The kind of place where no one passes by unless they're lost. I arrived late in the afternoon, just before sunset. The air was dry and sharp, the wind carrying sand that stuck to my clothes and got in my mouth. I parked my old truck about 30 yards from where I set up my tent. I didn't bring much, just a small cooler, a lantern, a folding chair, and a sleeping bag. The sun started sinking fast, turning everything gold and then blood red before it disappeared behind the distant ridges. By the time I finished setting up, the sky was already that deep blue-black that comes before full darkness. I sat for a while just listening to the desert. It's never fully silent. There's always something. Crickets, the distant cry of some night bird, the soft scrape of wind over rock. But out there, every sound feels louder, sharper, more alive. I remember eating a sandwich and thinking about how peaceful it felt. It's strange how that same silence that calms you can also make you feel like you're being watched. I brushed that thought off at the time. After dark, I lit a small fire. The flames flickered in the wind and the light only reached a few feet around me. Beyond that was pure blackness. The stars came out, endless and heavy, like they were pressing down. I sat there for an hour or so, just letting my eyes wander from the fire to the sky. Then I started hearing something. It was faint at first, like a soft dragging sound somewhere far off. I figured it was just the wind pulling a branch or a small animal moving through the dry brush. It wasn't rare to hear coyotes or rabbits out there. I didn't move, but then it came again, closer this time, slow, deliberate. Not like the light steps of an animal, more like something heavy trying to stay quiet. I turned off the lantern so only the fire was burning, hoping to let my eyes adjust to the dark. I looked out toward the direction I thought the sound came from, but there was nothing, just the faint outlines of rock and desert shrubs. I sat there, barely breathing, waiting to hear it again. For a long minute, there was nothing. Then I heard something that froze me completely. A voice. It wasn't clear or close, but it was definitely a human sound. A low, rough sort of voice, like someone trying to call out but not wanting to be heard. It didn't sound like words, just a noise that mimicked speech. My first thought was that maybe someone was lost, maybe another camper or hiker. But the area I was in wasn't one people wandered into by accident. And something about that sound didn't feel right. I stood up slowly, grabbed my flashlight from the cooler, and scanned the darkness. The beam of light cut through the air, hitting the sand, the rocks, the twisted bushes, but nothing moved. The night was dead still. I didn't hear the voice again. Eventually, I tried to shake it off and told myself it was probably some weird echo or animal sound. I didn't want to spook myself over nothing. I put out the fire before going into the tent. Inside, I zipped myself up in the sleeping bag and tried to relax. The desert gets cold fast after sundown, and the silence outside had that weight again. I laid there for a long time listening, trying to convince myself I was just overthinking. Around midnight, I started drifting off. Then I heard it again. This time it was much closer. A slow, scraping noise moving around the side of my tent. It sounded like something brushing against the fabric, like fingertips dragging lightly along it. My whole body locked up. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The sound stopped, then started again near the back of the tent. It circled around slowly, stopping and starting, like someone pacing just outside. I didn't open the tent. Couldn't. I just laid there, staring at the roof, trying to listen over my heartbeat. The sound stopped completely after a few minutes. I waited another 10 before I even dared to move. When I finally worked up the courage, I quietly unzipped the tent halfway and looked out. The moon had come up, pale and sharp. It was bright enough to see the shape of my truck, the cooler, the fire pit, all still untouched. Then I saw something about 20 feet away. It was crouched low behind a bush, not completely hidden. It looked like a person, but something was off about the way it was shaped. Its limbs were too long, arms bent at strange angles. I could see pale skin catching the moonlight. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, facing my direction. I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks, so I stayed still, staring. After a few seconds, it shifted slightly, smooth, slow, like it was trying not to make a sound. That's when I knew it wasn't an illusion. I didn't make a noise. I backed into the tent and zipped it closed, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the zipper. I didn't sleep at all. I just laid there with my knife in my hand, waiting for something to happen. I could hear faint movements outside every now and then, sometimes a soft step, sometimes that same dragging sound. I kept watching the tent walls for any sign of shadow or movement. The night felt endless. When dawn finally started to creep in, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked around. The light was still weak, gray and cold. Everything looked normal again. No footprints that I could see, no sign of anything. But the area behind that bush looked disturbed, like something had been there for a while. The sand was pressed down, and there were faint tracks that looked half human, half animal. I packed up as fast as I could. My hands were still shaking when I threw everything into the truck. The air felt thick and heavy, and even though the sun was rising, the feeling in my chest didn't fade. I started the engine and didn't even look back. I drove until I hit the main road and kept going until I reached the first gas station I could find. When I got out to fill up, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. On the side of the truck near the bed, there were handprints. Long, thin, and smeared in what looked like mud or dried blood. The fingers were too long, the shape wrong. I just stood there staring at them for a while. I went back home and didn't tell anyone about it for weeks. Every time I tried to explain it, I realized how crazy it sounded. But that feeling that something had followed me, watched me, that stayed. For months afterward, I'd wake up at night thinking I heard that dragging sound outside my window. It's been years now. I haven't gone camping alone since that night. I still live in Arizona. Still see those same open stretches of desert when I drive out of town. Sometimes I'll pull over and look out across the land, remembering how quiet it was out there, how small I felt. And every time I think about setting up a tent again, I can almost hear that sound, slow, careful, patient, moving just outside the edge of the firelight. I've learned that silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's just waiting for you to notice what's in it. It was the summer of 2013, and I was 24. I remember that year clearly because it was the first time I decided to camp completely alone. I had done plenty of trips with friends before, usually somewhere in the forests of Northern California or the mountains near Lake Tahoe, but I wanted something quieter this time. Something that didn't involve people talking, drinking, or playing music late into the night. I wanted silence. I picked a place called Bear Creek in Montana, somewhere about 3 hours north of Missoula. The name made it sound more dramatic than it really was. It was just a long stretch of dirt road surrounded by tall pines and old fire roads that disappeared into the trees. Hardly anyone went there, at least according to the few camping forums I checked. That was what I wanted, a place where I could hear myself think. I arrived late in the afternoon, maybe around 5 or 6. The sky was pale and heavy, like rain might come later, but the air was still warm enough to be comfortable. I parked my old gray Ford pickup by a clearing and set up my small one-person tent near the treeline. There was a narrow creek about 30 feet away. I could hear it running softly as I hammered the stakes into the ground. The sound of water was comforting, constant but not loud, just enough to fill the empty space. After setting up camp, I made a small fire pit using a few rocks I found scattered nearby. I cooked a can of beans and some sausage on my little portable stove. The fire crackled, and the woods around me began to dim. The air smelled like damp soil and pine sap, thick and raw. When darkness finally settled in, it felt total. No distant house lights, no highway hum, nothing. Just blackness and the faint shimmer of the creek. I remember how different that darkness felt from city nights. It wasn't just dark. It was full, like something was filling every inch of the forest with quiet. It was strange but peaceful at first. I went to sleep sometime after 10. My sleeping bag felt warm and tight, the ground uneven under my back but tolerable. For a while, all I could hear was the creek and the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. I must have drifted off easily because the next thing I remember is waking up to a noise that didn't fit. It was a sharp, irregular sound, like something snapping under weight, not the soft kind of crack from wind-blown branches. This one was deliberate, heavy. I lay there still, my eyes open in the dark, listening. My first thought was that it was an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. But the sound wasn't coming from the direction of the creek. It was coming from behind the tent, from the woods. The steps came closer, one at a time, with pauses between them. Crunching pine needles, snapping twigs, something moving slowly but steadily. The kind of pace that didn't feel random. I remember holding my breath for too long. My chest hurt from it. I tried to listen past the pounding in my ears, but the sound just stopped. No more steps. No sound at all now except the faint water. I waited maybe a minute before unzipping the tent, just enough to look out. My flashlight was by my boots. I turned it on and shone it around the clearing. Everything looked the same. The fire pit was a pile of dim orange embers. My truck sat a few yards away. The trees stood still, black outlines against the faint glow of the sky. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon rummaging around. I zipped the tent closed again and lay down, though it took a long time to fall back asleep. When I woke again, it was around 3 a.m. I knew because my phone screen lit up the time before dying. The battery had been low. The rain had started sometime earlier. I could hear it pattering on the tent, steady but not too strong. What pulled me out of sleep this time wasn't sound. It was light, faint moving light. It flickered against the tent fabric, dull yellow, shifting. My first thought was lightning, but the rain had no thunder. The light moved like someone was walking with a lantern or a flashlight just outside the tent. Slow, uneven movements. I sat up quickly, every muscle in my body tense. My heart was hammering again, but this time I felt something else under it. A cold realization that no one else should be here. There were no other campsites within miles. I hadn't seen a single car or person the entire drive-in. The light passed once more, sliding across the tent wall, then stopped. I grabbed the flashlight beside me again and held it, my hand shaking. I wanted to unzip the tent, but I couldn't bring myself to make noise. The rain softened, and the only thing I could hear was the faint creak of my tent fabric moving with the wind. After maybe 2 or 3 minutes, the light faded completely, just gone. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping that flashlight, every few minutes checking the zipper, half expecting to hear footsteps again. Nothing else happened, but the silence after that felt different, heavy, watching. When morning finally came, the air was gray and damp. The rain had stopped but left everything soaked. I unzipped the tent and stepped out carefully, scanning the clearing. The first thing I noticed was the ground near the treeline, deep impressions in the mud.
Bootprints.
They weren't mine. They led from the trees to about 15 feet behind my tent and then back toward the woods again. There were at least 3 or 4 clear steps, each one sharp and recent. The shape looked like work boots, wide and worn at the heel. My stomach dropped when I realized how close they came to where I had been sleeping. I followed them only a few feet before they disappeared into the thicker brush. The mud thinned there, and the rain had washed out any detail. I felt something tighten in my chest, an awareness that someone had been standing there in the middle of the night, in the rain, watching my tent. I didn't eat breakfast. I barely packed properly. I just shoved everything into the truck bed, folded the tent while it was still wet, and left. The road was muddy and rough, but I didn't care. Every turn of the wheels felt like I was pulling myself further away from something I didn't want to understand. When I reached the main highway, I stopped at a small diner in the next town over to get coffee and let my hands stop shaking. My clothes smelled like smoke and rain. I must have looked awful because the waitress kept glancing at me. I didn't tell her anything, didn't even look anyone in the eye. That night, when I got home, I checked the online camping forum where I had read about Bear Creek. I scrolled through older posts. Most were from years ago, people saying how empty and peaceful the place was. But one thread stood out. A short comment someone had made about hearing strange footsteps near their campsite. Another person replied saying they found an old, abandoned hunting shack about a mile in the woods from there. They said it looked like someone had been living in it recently. Old food cans, torn blankets, and footprints all around. That's when it clicked. Whoever had been out there that night wasn't just wandering. They were living somewhere in those woods. Maybe they saw the light from my fire, maybe they were curious, maybe worse. I thought about those slow steps, the pauses, the way the light moved past my tent. I imagined a person, wet, silent, standing just a few feet away, watching me sleep. It's been years since then, but I haven't gone camping alone again. I still love the woods, but not the silence anymore. Silence means something different now. It means something could be standing there, just far enough that you can't see it, waiting for you to fall asleep again.